You quickly touched on wild plants there at the end, and that's an important distinction we make here. The fact that the fruits and vegetables we're buying at the grocery store or the farmer's market, and you can clarify this, a lot of them, if not all of them, have been changed a lot from their wild forms.
Every single one of them. So, for whatever number of wild plants there are in the outside world, only a very, very small percentage of them ever became food for our ancestors, or even food for those of us today that are still, foraging and dealing with wild plants. And only a fraction of those plants lent themselves to some sort of domestication, where in early years through selective pressure, but later on nowadays through chemistry, we're genetically modifying these plants to produce a certain outcome. Rarely is the genetic mutations that are taking place now focused on making something healthier. It's usually focused on things like making it sweeter, or making the seeds smaller, or making the fruits bigger. Or actually, let me grab something real quick. Hold on, it's right here.
Sounds good.
I have a nixtamalization and maize class this weekend, so I had stuff out. This is even an heirloom cob of maize. Here is an ancestral cob of maize, and I don't know if you can see it, but do you see the difference between this and modern corn or modern maize?
Yeah, and I know from your work, each kernel is individually wrapped there.
Each kernel is individually wrapped. So one of the genetic mutations that took place in the domestication of maize was, and most grains are like this, like a wheat grain, as everyone. Imagine if somebody gave you this and said, your parents gave you this and said, shuck this, and then we're going to put corn on the cob. Like, you'd be out there all day long. So the decisions that people are making when they're putting plants through domestication is for things like somebody making more money or a consumer's palate to be happy with it. It's not necessarily because it has more vitamins or more protein or more something like this in it. And usually it's at the expense of the nutrients. There's an amazing book called...
we can link it up if you think
we can link it up. I remember it. It's a fantastic book about the destruction of nutrients in plants through the domestication, and Eating on the Wild Side. That's the name of the book, Eating on the Wild Side. And every chapter is divided into a different food, like apples and garlic and whatever. But the example is, right now, an apple today has between a half and a third the nutrition of an apple that our parents would have had access to. It's sweeter, it has more calories, it has more carbohydrates, but it has less nutrition in it. So we have to eat 2 apples and get all the carbohydrates and all the other sugars and things with it on top of it to even come close to the nutrients that our parents got when they ate an apple. And that's happening throughout our food system.
And how do you feel about that domestication? Because to me, it sounds like, hearing you talk, there's pros and cons. Whether it be more sugar, that's a bad thing. Less nutrition, a bad thing. But we've made the food more accessible. But what I want to get into is the interaction with our biology. How new is this? Because we were talking millions of years before that our biology has interacted with these different nutrients and foods, and even dismissing the things like blood sugar, nutrients, because this food is so new to us in the timeline of history. I don't hear a lot of people talking about that engagement of the actual food with our biology.
Well, it's a really good point. And let me answer that in 2 ways. First, the reason that we're going, this is, I think, a really good example. I think the domestication of these plants has been really one of the worst things that's ever happened in the history of our diets, period. I mean, if you look at, and you might have mentioned it before, but if anybody's interested in a really short, powerful read, it's dated, it's a couple decades old, but Jared Diamond, who wrote Guns, Germs, and Steel and the book Collapse, he's an incredible author. He wrote a very short article called The Worst Mistake in the History of the Human Race. You can Google it. There's PDFs of it all over the place. It's only about 4 or 5 pages long, but it's a powerful article. And I've assigned it in almost every college class I've ever taught. and it sparks a lot of discussion and reframes the way we think about the development of agriculture. And the whole thesis is pretty much, if our ancestors knew what they were doing when they started domesticating plants, they would have dropped their hoes and their plows or whatever and run in the other direction. But the other things that come up through this article, and this is well known in the anthropological space, is that with the development of agriculture comes a whole lot of other things. In addition to problems in our diets and in our health, a lot of other things happen as a result of it that most of us see as negative things. So number one, the development of social hierarchy starts with the development of agriculture. The disconnection from our food and where it comes from begins with the development of agriculture. There's no evidence anywhere in the world of organized warfare ever before the development of agriculture. And this continues and continues on. And I know some of this might come as a surprise to some people in your head, what the hell is he talking about? But when you start to understand how these things all link together, it makes a lot of sense. But one of the other things that happens with the development of agriculture is as we're breeding these plants, one of the things we breed away from these plants, and this is going to sound counterintuitive, but bear with me for a minute. One of the things we breed out of these plants are their own natural defense mechanisms. So we take wild plants, and if you think about, you're trying to kill dandelions in your yard, or you think about the weeds that keep coming up through the cracks in your sidewalk, and you're spending half your summer trying to get rid of these wild plants, and the other half of your summer in your garden in the backyard doing everything you can to keep the plants you want growing, and they're getting attacked by all sorts of other insects and they're or disease or fungus or whatever. I mean, think about what's happening here. These wild plants are perfectly designed to defend themselves. Like if you put the dandelion seeds in the ground, you put 100 dandelion seeds in the ground, you're going to have 100 dandelion plants in your yard, no matter what, in almost all cases. But you plant 100 tomato plants in your backyard, you'd be lucky if you get a percentage of them to come up and produce fruit. So when we're going to the Amazon to work with traditional processors of manioc. Manioc is an incredibly toxic root. It has cyanide-producing compounds. It kills people every year still today. But this plant is heavily processed. It goes through a fermentation stage and a drying stage and a whole bunch of things that I can't wait to witness and be a part of. But once it's finished, it becomes tapioca and a couple other things. But tapioca flour is made from this incredibly poisonous manioc root that has to be processed. Now, the crazy thing is, we have figured out how to genetically manipulate this and create something we call sweet manioc. And if you go to a really high-end grocery store or one of these off-the-wall grocery stores, you can actually buy something called sweet manioc, which has a much lower toxin load. And in fact, all you have to do is cook it and you detoxify to the point that it becomes safe and edible. But even though these traditional groups have access to the sweet version of this, the less toxic version of this, they intentionally decide every single year to continue to plant and harvest the most poisonous version of this. And the reason is because they don't have to worry about it. They put it in the field and they get 100% amazing yield because it has all the natural defense mechanisms, which to us are toxins. And they're also, keep the insects away and the disease and the fungus, and then they process it after the fact. The processing is incredibly, incredibly important. But what we've done with most of the modern plants, and you're asking about the benefits and the cons, we have stripped these plants. Now, we haven't eliminated all these toxins. There's still a problem for us, especially when we eat high amounts of them or don't process them properly. But we've stripped them of their natural defense mechanisms. So here we go, plant them in a field, and we have to hit them with all sorts of insecticides and fungicides and herbicides to make sure, artificially, we're putting it back into it. We're destroying the planet. We're making ourselves sick from it. And then we put it in the grocery store, and they're just low enough on the toxic load level that most of us aren't thinking about it. And we just go ahead and eat as many potatoes as we want, not even thinking that they're still loaded with glycoalkaloids, just not as much as their ancestral version. So we're disconnected enough. These things are just safe enough. It's not on our radar to process them properly. They're defenseless, so we have to hit it with all sorts of artificial things in the field, and it's a lose-lose situation all the way across. So even though I don't eat a ton of vegetables, I do still eat plants. I process them properly. I'm very selective about what I eat. I still love to teach foraging classes because when you go foraging, you're tuned into all of these things at the same time. First of all, the localness and the seasonality are literally right in your face. But also the idea that, yeah, these plants have toxins. And if we're going to consume them, we have to eat them at this time of the year. We have to do these sorts of things to them to make them as safe as they can be. And we have to process them this way to unlock the nutrients that they have inside. And I wish, I'm not trying to talk anybody out of eating vegetables whatsoever, but just as much as if you eat meat, I'm convinced you should at least butcher an animal once or take a butchering class or be there to understand it and connect with it. If you eat vegetables, then I highly advise taking a foraging class sometime and connecting on that level as well, even if you're only going to buy vegetables at the grocery store.
I love that example of the tomato and the dandelion. And I've never thought about it that way, where, yeah, dandelions, we can't get rid of them. And our tomato plant, if we leave and go away for a weekend and don't water it, we're likely going to come back and it's going to be keeled over. They're just so weak and they've been bred this way intentionally. So now that I have this new perspective, it's almost comical what we've done.
Yeah, and we do it literally. I've done it in the same day. When I used to keep a garden, I would spend half the day weeding and the other half trying to tend to these other plants.
Well, let's bring it to meat, because I think a lot of times when it comes to this conversation of domestication, plants get picked on and meat gets pushed aside and we don't go there. So let's bring in the modern cow, chickens, pigs. How different are these foods from our ancestral past?
That is a fantastic question. And I'm really, really, really glad you brought it up. So one of the big differences, I would say right away, is that you named the three main ones. I mean, truly, what you didn't even name was the most popular meat in the world is goat. And it's hardly in anybody's diet in America. So, but realistically, pigs, chickens, and cows are the main meat sources in the modern American diet if we're eating meat. And we've, in some cases, because of a couple different factors, have demonized some of that, right? The pig has been demonized for a few reasons. There's several books that talk about meat and really push the pork aside for a variety of reasons. And I found out after the fact some of them were for religious reasons and had nothing to do with health. But we've also, because of the way most chickens in this country are raised, a lot of people have pushed chicken aside as well. And I completely understand that. So for most health conscious meat consuming people in this country, beef is the turn to, right? So even if beef was magical, and I love beef, do not get me wrong, beef, I absolutely love beef, and beef is probably represents the most amount of meat in my diet on a yearly basis. I mean, there's times of the year when we're eating mostly venison and times of the year we're eating other things, but beef overall is probably the most consumed meat in my family. The fact that we're honing in on one meat source is new. Like, that is not ancestral. That is not, I mean, if you're making decisions about your diet and the foundation of those decisions are, I'm trying to eat an ancestrally appropriate diet, I don't care how good the meat source is. Eating one source of meat is not ancestrally appropriate. Now, also, please do understand that cows were not around 30,000 years ago, right? So the fact that it's domesticated means it's new within the past. If animals are concerned, 8,000 to 10,000 years, but it is new. Not necessarily does that mean it's good or bad, but it is new. And there's a lot of nuances here as well, because, for example, we eat a lot of beef, we eat a lot of pork, and we eat some chicken. The problem with chicken is, of the three, high quality chicken to me is the hardest thing to source in most parts of this country. We can get chicken everywhere, but high quality chicken is one of the hardest things to source. We eat a lot of venison, and some people would say, "Oh my God, that's amazing because venison is a wild meat and it's eating a wild diet." Well, yeah, but I live out here on the Eastern Shore of Maryland. There are cornfields everywhere, and almost every one of these cornfields is loaded with GMO corn, sprayed with all kinds of nasty things. And I hunt those fields, or I hunt areas around these fields, and all of my venison, here that I shoot, that I eat, is corn finished. I mean, it literally spends the last at least weeks of its life eating GMO corn. So it's not as easy to say, I mean, I am asking the question. I don't know. Is a grass-fed, grass-finished, well-raised cow a better source of meat than a wild deer that finished its life on GMO corn that's sprayed with all sorts of nonsense? I don't know that answer, but the point, I mean, the reason I'm even bringing it up is because it is an incredibly complicated discussion that is larger than sound bites on an Instagram thing that most people end up saying. The other part of that is the issue. One thing that I'm starting to try to figure out on my own as well is, what about that fat piece? I love animal fat. I think it's one of the most incredible sources of nutrition. I think we should have a very high fat diet, especially if we're low carb. But domesticated animals carry more fat on them than most wild animals do. Now, that said, when we look at the way traditional groups today access nutrition from their animals that they harvest, and we're confident, we even see it in the archaeological record, they are eating all of the animal and also breaking open the bones and extracting the marrow on the inside. So it doesn't matter even how lean an animal is. It doesn't matter what time of the year the animal's been killed. Those bones are still loaded with marrow. An animal will die of starvation before it depletes its marrow resources. So for those people, and I bring this up because some people have suggested to me, well, heck, that's fine. But if you're in equatorial Africa and you're hunting these animals and they're lean and they're not eating all the same amount of fat that you're getting on a cow in America, I would disagree, because they are not only eating all the visceral fat, but they're also eating all the subcutaneous fat. They're also breaking up the bones for marrow. And we also have evidence for boiling the bones. And the other source of fat in an animal is what we call bone grease. And we know people were doing this around the world and continue to do so. So when you put a bone, and anybody who's made bone broth knows this, if you put bones and you make bone broth in water and you cook it long enough, you have a layer of fat that comes up off the top. Even if all you put in that pot was bones, you have fat that comes to the top. And that fat actually comes from the walls of the bones, the matrix of the bones, and that's called bone grease. And we know that was important to our ancestors as well.
As we're talking about deer and eating corn from the fields, it gets me thinking about different diets of animals that have been domesticated. And we have our grass-fed, grass-finished beef. And the difference there between, say, a monogastric, like a pig or a chicken, is that they process grains if they're being fed an inappropriate diet. Obviously, the best is to get an animal that's fed the correct diet for the animal and for us.
Absolutely.
But I want to highlight the point that if we're going to eat beef, because of the 4 chambers in the stomach, the end product of that beef is very different if it's being fed an inappropriate diet than chicken or pigs who are monogastric like us. And if they're being fed the wrong diet, that's when linoleic acid can spike in their food. Sorry, not in their food, in our food when we eat that meat, which could bring us into the whole linoleic acid vegetable oil piece. And there's people that say linoleic acid is bad no matter what. I'm not convinced that linoleic acid in a seed oil that's been heavily processed is the same as eating, say, pork that's had a non-appropriate diet. But there are people that kind of go both ways on that. Like linoleic acid is linoleic acid. So I've opened a lot of different pieces here. But what points I want to highlight are beef is different when we're getting beef that's fed CAFO. Again, we don't want to do that. But if we are eating that, it is different than the monogastrics who can't break down that inappropriate diet. And then their meat is very different than them eating the appropriate diet.
I 100% agree. I would also like to add, and actually, let me just very quick. The first time I professionally butchered a pig, I'd been messing around and trying to learn how to do these things myself for quite some time. But then finally, when I realized my life was going in the direction that it was, I realized I had to get professionally trained. So I went, those trainings took place at the Italian Culinary Institute in Calabria in southern Italy. And I remember when we were going through the butchering time there at the Italian Culinary Institute, we went out to this farm where they raised pigs, and they had them roaming. I mean, it looked like something from a Netflix special. I mean, it was gorgeous. They had these pigs roaming through the forest. They were eating literally olives and chestnuts. And then we picked out the pig, and then harvested the pig. Then we brought the pig back to the Italian Culinary Institute, and we started butchering this. And what floored me, the biggest, thing that happened in my mind as I'm doing this is it looked like I was cutting open a cow. Like, not for the anatomy, but the color of the meat was almost the color of beef. I mean, and so I grew up in the 70s and the 80s where they were literally breeding pigs to be the other white meat. They were breeding the color and the nutrition out of pigs because everybody thought we needed to go in the direction of low-fat chicken breast sort of thing. And this pig, this heritage pig that was on an amazing diet, had pork color, the color of the best steak you've ever had in your life. It completely blew my mind. So there are drastic differences, like you mentioned, in not only the quality of the animal, but how it was raised, how it was fed. Equally important, how it was slaughtered, right? How it was killed and how it was taken apart. All of those factors play an incredibly large role in everything from the taste and the nutritional value of the final product. However, we could sit here all day and have a conversation about this is exactly what we should have and the direction that the food industry should be going in and all of that. And it's all a very important conversation. But for most people listening to this, eating nothing but grass-fed, grass-finished local beef for the rest of their life is economically impossible, right? For every day. I mean, not for an anniversary thing, but for literally every day. And what I want to make sure people understand is there are horrible things happening in the CAFO industry and the industrialized food system, no doubt. And I hope we get to a place, and I hope we get to it soon, where that's no longer a reality of our modern food system. But it currently is a reality of our modern food system. And for some people, and that is that meat from that industry is the only meat that they can afford. And if the question is between that meat or eggplant rollatini, I would choose that meat every single time. And I know it's a hard discussion to have, but people need to have it more because we have to give ourselves some grace and we have to realize where we are, what resources we have access to in whatever form that means. And in any case, meat is more nutrient dense and bioavailable and safer than vegetables are in our diet and should be the basis of our diets. And look, I'll be fully honest. The other day, I went to the grocery store after I left. I came home and it was the only grocery store that was open, and it had like the big bag of ground beef, and it is what I got, and it is what we ate at home, and it was not grass-fed, grass-finished. And I have no idea where those cows came from. That the meat that it came from, it probably had 400 cows in that package. That is what I fed my family, and at that particular moment, that particular day, that's the best resource that I had available at my disposal. So I don't want people that are listening to this and say, oh, I cannot afford that. I don't have access to that every day. What am I going to do? The answer is you're going to do the best that you can. And you should be very, very proud of the steps that you've already taken to get to that place. And then when that's comfortable, take one more small step and start implementing that.
There are so many different variables, and it's almost impossible in a conversation like this to address them all. You mentioned the affordability, the ethics of these animals, how they're being treated, the look of the meat when you cut into that pig. I mentioned the linoleic acid, so you got to look at the nutrients. There's so many different pieces. But part of what I was trying to address before is that when it comes to animals that aren't eating their species appropriate diet, because cows have 4 stomachs,
right,
the end product is going to be better than going, even arguably, eating an organic chicken that's fed an inappropriate diet. Because the linoleic acid can be a lot higher in that just from being fed the wrong food.
I see what you're saying. And it wouldn't just be in that. I mean, across the board, the nutritional profile of all of these things are completely different. Also, one of the things people ask me all the time, I'm a very huge proponent of eating organ meats for all the reasons we mentioned earlier, for nutritional reasons, for ethical reasons, for sustainability reasons, for monetary reasons, for all these reasons. And it is ancestrally appropriate to eat the entire animal. But anytime I say something like this, there's somebody that asks me a question and says, wait, I get it, but the liver, isn't it just full of toxins? And I shouldn't eat the liver because it's full of toxins. No, the liver is not a storage house of toxins. The liver is a filter for some of the toxins that are that detoxification takes place in our bodies. But the toxins do not get stored there. If there's the toxin load in the fat of the animal is higher than the toxin load of the liver. So the toxin load of an animal is certainly something to consider, but it isn't the liver we should be demonizing. We should be looking more at things like the fat. So another point is, what is the lifestyle and diet of these animals, and what does that mean for the toxin buildup inside of this animal? And again, for somebody that eats a massive amount of animal fat, that's something I really need to consider, because that's one of the storehouses of where all these toxins are. So it is incredibly important.
When you talked about bone broth, you mentioned that layer of fat from the bone that builds on top. Would you say for somebody who at this point isn't using any of the organs, chopping them all up, putting them in a pot with the bones, making bone broth would be the easiest way to get started with all this?
Absolutely. So if there's when you're doing any butchering, whether you have a pig laid out on your counter, or if it's just a chicken on your kitchen counter, if there chicken and it comes with that little package, it always kills me that it doesn't matter where we get our chickens from. That little package has always a varying amount of organs inside of it. Sometimes there's no heart, sometimes there's 2 hearts. I mean, it's for sure it's never coming from the chicken that you have in front of you. But regardless, you have usually the neck in there, the gizzard in there, the heart in there, and the liver in there, right? So all of those things have incredible applications. But if at least you're not going to, if you're like, I'm not there yet, do not throw them away. At least throw them in your bone broth, and you're gonna be able to get some of the nutrients. And I know it sounds strange to some people. You're going to get some, in a good way. You're going to get some of that flavor as well. If you are of that mindset, like, what, I'm ready to dip my toes into this, but what am I going to do with one chicken liver, this size, right? Right. So my suggestion is, if you're not going to do if you don't have anything to do with any of the organs or the neck, at least throw it in your bone broth. If you think you might do something with them, but you're either not there yet or you don't have enough to do that, I would always keep 3 containers in my freezer. 1 for the liver, 1 for the gizzards, and 1 for the heart. And I would take my chicken hearts and I'd put them in the one and the liver. And then eventually, after several weeks, I have enough liver that I'm going to make pate out of, right? Or something, whatever it is I'm going to do with it. And then I can pull it out. A fantastic gateway drug for organ meats is the heart. I mean, the heart is essentially a muscle. So from a texture perspective and a look perspective and a flavor perspective, it's not foreign to most of us. It really has a lot of the qualities that meat has. It's a little bit tougher because it gets used all the time, but that's a great, just chicken hearts are amazing. Grab a few chicken hearts, put them on a skewer, put a little something on them, salt, little fat, and throw them on the grill. Grilled chicken hearts are one of my favorite things in the world. And again, it's not going to be a foreign flavor and texture and smell to you because it's so much like the other meat. It just has more nutrients than the other meat does.
How do you feel about this new meat that's coming? Might already be here. I don't follow it too closely. Factory grown meat.
When we were 7 years ago now, I think, maybe 6 years ago, we were living in Ireland. There was a big program, and they went to they did this thing at these farms, and they asked me to go out, and I butchered a pig during the program. And then they had this sort of sit down, and they asked me a question like that, and I was not prepared for it, but I answered it the best that I could. I still feel the same way. I think it's horrible on every single level. From a nutritional level, my problem is we get fooled into thinking, we have this hubris all the time that we know everything there is to know about something now. But if you go back 5 years, we knew even less. And 5 years before that, like what we know, the qualities in something like meat, we do not know all of the things that are in there. So number one, in order to replicate something artificially that is as complex as meat, you'd have to already know all the things that are in there and how they operate, and which we don't. I would bet everything that I have on the fact that we do not fully comprehend everything that's in something like meat. So it's impossible to fully replicate it. And then can we fully replicate it? Probably not. But another thing that I don't think people are necessarily talking about with it or thinking about when they consider something like these artificially produced meats is it is one more at least link in a food chain. It's separating us from where our food is coming from. And anything that separates me from where my food is coming from is a sense of loss, a sense of misunderstanding, a sense of disempowerment, and allows somebody else to control what I'm eating and the decisions that I'm making for myself and my family and my community. So even if we knew everything about meat, which we don't, even if we could fully replicate what those things are, which I'm confident we can't, I still would resist it because it is one more separation between me and where my food is coming from. And I think that's one of the worst things that's happened in our dietary past, and it's one of the things that I'm working very hard to regain.
If you enjoyed that clip, you're going to want to head over here and catch the full episode. I'll see you over there.
We went to Sardinia. The place in Sardinia we were at was actually the epicenter of the first blue zone ever identified. It was not only in Sardinia, it was actually in the same village. What we experienced there was the exact opposite from a food perspective.